Hi there, and welcome to the town of Greenock on the west coast of Scotland. It is September 2023. Behind me, if you can see through the cloud and the mist, is the River Clyde estuary, which runs from the city of Glasgow in the east to the Irish Sea in the west. Now, the reason I brought you out here today is to tell you a Cold War story. And this will be similar to a video I made on a crash between a Soviet main battle tank and a train in East Germany in 1988. However, this time the crash is an altogether larger magnitude because it involves a crash between two nuclear submarines in the estuary behind me. Now, that alone does not make this story notable. What makes this story really interesting is who the crash was between, where it took place, and then the fact that all three governments involved covered up the story for 43 years. So stay with me while I tell you the story of the 1974 Clyde Estuary Victor crash. Our story takes place in 1974, but the trail begins much earlier than that, in the offices of the US Central Intelligence Agency in the year 2017. In January that year, the CIA automatically declassified several million documents, one of which was a very interesting communication between Brent Scowcroft, the Deputy National Security Advisor, and Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State in 1974. The communique reads,
Secret, eyes only. November 3rd, 1974. To Henry A. Kissinger. From Brent Scowcroft.
Have just received word from the Pentagon that one of our Poseidon submarines has just collided with a Soviet submarine. The SSBN James Madison was departing Holy Loch to take up station when it collided with a Soviet submarine waiting outside the port to take up trail. Both submarines surfaced and the Soviet boat subsequently submerged again. There is no report yet of the extent of damage or other details. We'll keep you posted.
This was the first time anybody in the United Kingdom had heard anything of this incident some 43 years earlier. So predictably, our unreliable mainstream media went into hyperbole meltdown.
Cold War catastrophe. US and Russian nuclear submarines crashed.
US and Soviet nuclear sub crash off Britain could have led to World War III.
World War III could have started in 1974, but it was kept secret for 43 years.
The UK media storm eventually caught the attention of the Russian media, who mocked the exaggeration and panic, and produced a factual report, even tracking down Soviet sailors on board the sub that day.
Здравствуйте, время новостей на Первом. О самых важных событиях расскажем прямо сейчас.
Из 13 миллионов документов, с которых в этом месяце ЦРУ сняла гриф секретности и разместила в интернете, одна телеграмма привлекла особое внимание английских газет. В ноябре 1974-го советник президента Форда по национальной безопасности Брент Scowcroft направил ее Генри Киссинджеру, который в то время...
To save me exercising my not brilliant Russian language skills and subtitling the whole NTV report, I'll summarise it for you. The report is mildly mocking in tone, suggesting, quite correctly, that the UK media are emotional and panicky for suggesting World War III could have been a result of this minor incident. Scowcroft's communique to Kissinger is then translated into Russian. But the real revelation is the Russian TV report discloses the exact location of the collision, something the American report doesn't, and it is a revelation. The report confirms that the collision took place in the Clyde estuary opposite Greenock, deep inside UK sovereign territory. Geography plays a major part in this story, so I think we need to get the maps out. To start off, here's where I am in the world today. Today I'm in the Scottish maritime town of Greenock, which incidentally is my late father's hometown. Greenock is 25 miles west of Scotland's largest city, Glasgow, and served for many centuries as a port town for the River Clyde estuary. But much of the shipping and fishing industry has now gone from the town in the 21st century. You could characterise Greenock as the UK's version of Russia's Murmansk, which is not a really flattering comparison. To the west of Greenock, the River Clyde becomes a very deep water sea estuary known as the Firth of Clyde, and branching off to the north of three deep water sea lochs. Loch being Scottish or Gaelic for a sea inlet. The remoteness and the depth of the water together with good road and rail links, has historically made the Firth of Clyde ideal for submarine operations. In the present day, Loch is home to the UK Royal Navy submarine fleet based at Faslane. But there's the two other locks I want you to pay close attention to: Loch Long and Holy Loch. Because between the years 1961 and 1992, the Royal Navy was joined in the Firth of Clyde by the US Navy. The Holy Loch became the site of US Navy Refit Site 1 and also Submarine Squadron 14, Subron 14. Unlike the Royal Navy submarine facilities at Faslane, at Holy Loch all facilities were afloat. The US Navy had no permanent shore-based facilities, although they did rent a number of private houses for some permanent staff. Refit Site 1 consisted of two principal enormous vessels: a submarine tender, which was basically a floating submarine maintenance facility and a stores depot. The submarine tender remained at anchor for several years at Holy Loch, and 4 separate ships fulfilled this role throughout its existence. Spares and supplies were transported from the USA directly to the submarine tender by sea. The second principal vessel was the gargantuan USS Los Alamos, a large auxiliary floating dry dock vessel. A dry dock which was semi-submersible and large enough to lift a submarine out of the sea for maintenance. Other surface craft at Holy Loch included auxiliaries, tugs, floating cranes, etc. The purpose of the refit site was to enable US Navy submarines to remain on station and on patrol in the North Atlantic and the Soviet Arctic without the need to return to the USA for maintenance and crew changes. Every submarine had 2 crews, who simply flew from the USA to UK Air Force bases, either Lakenheath or Mildenhall, and then were bussed up to change over at Holy Loch. Right, let's go and visit Holy Loch in the 21st century. And to do that, I'm going to need to take the car ferry from Greenock across the Firth of Clyde. It takes just 20 minutes to cross from Greenock to Dunoon, and we're entering the Holy Loch now. Obviously, the Americans have gone. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, end of the Cold War, in 1992, US Subron 14 withdrew from Holy Loch back to the United States. And this is Dunoon and Holy Loch today, 30 years after the US Navy departed. We're at Leserato Point, between Hunters Quay and Dunoon. And directly out to the centre of the loch behind me, where you can see a present-day tugboat moored, is where, up till 1992, the US Navy installation, US Navy Refit Site 1, was moored. Returning now to the year 1974. In early autumn that year, our first submarine of interest, the USS James Madison, SSBN 627, entered Refit Site 1 at Holy Loch for its 5-yearly refit, which was due to take about 6 weeks, due completion in late October 1974. The James Madison was an SSBN, a submersible ship ballistic nuclear. She was built in 1964 and was 130 metres long. The crew was 15 officers and 130 enlisted men. The submarine was armed with conventional torpedoes, principally for self-defence, but its main role was to carry and deploy 16 Poseidon submarine-launched ballistic missiles, each Poseidon missile capable of carrying up to 10 multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicle nuclear warheads.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. T0. Fire. 1. Roger, approach and ignition.
With its unique location and a nuclear submarine fleet shrouded in secrecy, Holy Loch quickly became somewhat infamous in the media, both in fact and in fiction. The classic 1968 submarine and spy action movie, Ice Station Zebra, begins with submarine captain Rock Hudson receiving his orders to sail to the Soviet Arctic in the back room of a Dunoon pub. and he then sails his fictional nuclear submarine, the USS Tigerfish, from Holy Loch. Somewhat ironically, the 1974 collision would demonstrate that sometimes life imitates art. Now, sticking with the subject of human intelligence, espionage, spying, whatever you want to call it, it may surprise you to learn that this little remote Lochside community during the 60s and 70s and 80s was a hotbed of Soviet intelligence activity, almost as much as the Berlin Wall. How so? Well, get out of your mind the stereotypical spy movie. The dodgy bloke with a furry Ushanka hat, overcoat with a dodgy Russian accent and a Makarov pistol hiding in alleyways. That's not how it went down. It was much more subtle than that. And the absolute irony was, it was not Soviet undercover agents doing the spy. It was British citizens. Hunter's Key and Dunoon overlooked directly Holy Loch and Refit Site 1, and therefore there was little the US Navy could do to conceal the arrival and departure of surface ships and submarines. And without fail, this information will be diligently logged by a spotter and passed back to the Soviet Union. These spotters were amateurs, older people associated with the peace movement, who passed the information they logged back to an intermediary. Only rarely did they realise they were helping the USSR. The Soviets had a phrase for them: useful idiots. The diligent logging and reporting of submarine movements by peace activist spotters only got the Soviets basic intelligence. Therefore, another type of intelligence, espionage, was also employed at Holy Loch: covert human intelligence sources. And the local Lochside pub was where you were most likely to encounter one. In this scenario, we're going to examine how the Soviets could have known that the USS James Madison was going to depart Holy Loch on the 3rd of November 1974. This, of course, is all hypothetical, as is this Lochside pub that Mid-Journey has created for me, and which for legal reasons isn't the real Holy Loch Inn. American sailors based permanently at Holy Loch got regular runs ashore, or shore leave, whatever you want to call it. And of course, the two things that interest young male sailors the most are alcohol and pretty girls. I do think that Mid-Journey has been a bit too flattering here with its depiction of our two characters, a typical US sailor and a typical local Scottish girl. But hey, take the compliment. Despite his mandatory operational security training, and unfortunately several scotches later, our sailor here tries to impress this young lady with his role on the Holy Loch. He tells her he can see her again, but only after the 3rd of November, because he's got a big job on. The USS James Madison, which is berthed at Holy Loch, is going to get underway on missile patrol on the 3rd of November, but he's free to see her from the 4th. Realising this is intelligence gold, she casually elicits more details about the James Madison's move from her mark before making no excuses and leaving. Of course, the girl is in fact a foot soldier in the intelligence world, a scout hunter or a contact officer. She's probably deeply involved in the peace movement or a radicalised student. She'll be working for ideological reasons and won't have direct contact with the USSR. The scout hunter immediately passes on all of the information that she's elicited from our drunken sailor during the evening to her intermediary contact. Again, this will be a British citizen, usually outwardly an organiser in a peace or protest movement, sometimes a nationalist councillor or a union convener. It could be anybody. The local organiser or intermediary will be the first crossover between local intelligence and the Soviet Union. He will have a contact to pass over the information he gathers back to Moscow. This will be done in the United Kingdom and will be with a professional intelligence officer who will have a cover legend, sometimes a diplomat, but could be something as simple as a Soviet fishing trawler captain. Within hours of the date between the blonde scalp hunter and the US sailor in the Holy Loch pub, the information about the James Madison's imminent departure from Holy Loch is in Moscow and be passed between the desks of the KGB and the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. Seeing on the intelligence from the GRU, the Soviet Navy put the nearest SSN to the west coast of Scotland on alert and issue new orders.
Intelligence Update проявите. Reliability Assessment High. The ballistic missile submarine USS James Madison, which is currently located in US Navy dock at Holy Loch for refit. The submarine has recently boarded a new crew from USA and will get on deploy on ballistic missile patrol to the North Atlantic. So this gives expected Holy Loch departure on or around 3rd November 1974. Transit of Clyde not expected in daylight, with two surface utility escort ships.
The Soviet submarine captain would have been given orders to locate the USS James Madison and trailer on patrol undetected. This is bread and butter submarine warfare, and in the event of war, the SSN would destroy the US SSBN before it could fire its 16 Poseidon missiles at the USSR. Thanks to the 2017 Russian TV report, we now know that Soviet SSN given those orders was the K306. The K306 was a Soviet Project 671 Yorsh-class hunter-killer submarine, all given the NATO codename Victor 1. Powered by a nuclear reactor, the K306 was built in 1967. It was 93 metres long and had a crew of 27 commissioned officers and 68 other ranks. It carried 24 conventional torpedoes. Intercepting NATO SSBN's boomers departing the Clyde, the normal Soviet tactic would be to lie wait in one of two goose egg-shaped choke points north and south of the Clyde in international waters and try and acquire the target there. But on this occasion, the Soviet captain, possibly because he had specific intelligence of an exact time and date of departure, decided to push the envelope and take an enormous risk. Whether or not he did this with full Navy orders and authority, we still don't know. A former Russian submarine captain, who was a young submariner during the Cold War, explains the mindset back then to the Russian TV report.
В океане, особенно во времена холодной войны, постоянно шла игра в кошки-мышки. Я был командиром стратегической подводной лодки, и за мной охотились американские лодки-охотники. И то же самое делали наши лодки.
Because what appears to have happened then is the K306's captain, in an act of extreme daring and seamanship, instead of sitting off in the open sea, has navigated his submarine submerged up the Clyde estuary in the deep water channel and taken up a standoff position just outside the Holy Loch base itself. Now, after its infiltration of the River Clyde estuary during the night, this is the most likely location that the Soviet K306 submarine ended up. The entrance to Loch Long. And the reason the Soviet captain would have chosen this location, it is the deepest part of the loch. It's about 80 metres deep, about 100 metres behind me. More than enough for a Soviet Victor-class submarine to sit on the bottom of the loch, undetected, and wait and listen to the signals intelligence and sonar activity coming from the US Holy Loch base, waiting for the USS James Madison to start its run out. On the cold, grey morning of the 3rd of November 1974, the USS James Madison was preparing to depart the Holy Loch here. And about 2.5 kilometres to the east, at the bottom of Loch Long, round about here, was a Soviet K306. In the early daylight hours of the 3rd of November 1974, having completed its refit and the US Refit 1 site on the Holy Loch directly behind me, the USS James Madison, having taken a new crew on from the United States in the previous 48 to 72 hours, got underway and started making towards the centre of the Clyde estuary. Unbeknown to the Madison crew, lurking just 2.5 kilometres away on the loch floor and the entrance to Loch Long was a Soviet K306 submarine. Now, the Soviet captain would have plenty of notice that the Madison was on its way from signals intelligence and also from passive sonar soundings. It is then likely that the Soviet submarine has come to periscope depth and made low revolutions towards the centre of the loch to try and pick up the trail of the Madison and hide in its baffles. At some point after this, both submarines have collided. extra point is that when the submarines collided, according to the reports, the Madison was submerged. So what has gone on? We're now into the realms of guesswork in the absence of an official report. It is likely that after a long refit and prior to ballistic missile patrol, the James Madison has taken the opportunity to conduct a test dive once clear of Holy Loch. The Soviet captain would not have been expecting this because NATO submarine procedure is to remain on the surface all the way out to the Irish Sea. Hiding in the baffles of the Madison, the K306 would not have had much time to react and steer away from a now static and diving Madison, and a collision was inevitable. Not knowing the cause of the collision, the USS James Madison immediately resurfaced. Because the Soviet submarine had acquired a damaged torpedo tube and was taking on a bit of water, it also surfaced. Although the Russian TV report denies this was an emergency, it clearly was, because the Soviet sub has just declared its position deep inside NATO territory. As both submarines emergently surfaced in the centre of the Clyde, both sets of crew went about their damage control procedures. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, there followed a very surreal scene on the surface of the Clyde, with the US and Soviet submarines sat a couple of 100 metres opposite each other, trying to work out what damage had been caused to their individual boats. Fortunately, because the collision speed was so low, damage to the US James Madison was a crumpled nose cone, and to the K306, a large dent and damaged the outer torpedo doors on the port side. There were no human casualties, and no involvement of nuclear reactors or nuclear weapons. The leak on the K306's torpedo room was apparently quickly resolved, and before the crew of the James Madison had time to react, the Soviet submarine had dived again, and now made a hasty departure along the Clyde submerged and making a break for international waters before there was any reaction. The K306 apparently remained submerged at periscope depth because of fear of further flooding for the rest of the journey back to Murmansk 7 days later. The Soviet Union never talked about the incident, and it isn't known who the captain was or what happened to him after the incident. And much like the American crew, the Soviet sailors on the submarine were sworn to secrecy. The 1974 Victor crash was the most egregious breach of UK sovereign territory by the Soviet armed forces in the history of the Cold War. So you would think that NATO would be shouting it from the rooftops. So why then was it covered up at the time and for the next 4 decades? Well, the answer is simply politics. Firstly, you won't have heard much about the British during this incident, and that's because the British government was severely embarrassed by the whole affair. The Royal Navy had responsibility for securing the UK territorial waters and the Clyde submarine bases, not the US Navy, and to allow a Soviet Victor-class SSN to sail undetected into the heart of the NATO submarine operation was seen as absolutely unforgivable by the US government. In the Royal Navy's defence, they were occupied elsewhere at the time, fighting the Cod War. No, not the Cold War. You heard right, the Cod War. A territorial dispute over fishing grounds with Iceland. The Cod War was not really a real war, and only one person died in its conflict. But it tied up dozens of Navy surface craft protecting the UK fishing fleet from Icelandic gunboats. There was no follow-up of the K306 submarine because the US government did not inform the British government for many days after the crash. In 1974, the UK had re-elected Prime Minister Harold Wilson and his Labour Party government. The US government did not trust the Wilson administration at all and considered it infiltrated with Soviet sympathisers, and there was some truth in that. In the late 1960s, when Harold Wilson had previously been the British Prime Minister, he had made an enemy of the then US President, Lyndon B. Johnson, by refusing to support America either politically or militarily in Vietnam. Thanks principally to late 1960s counterculture and early 1970s radicalism, by the time of Wilson's second term as Prime Minister, the Labour movement was heavily influenced by communism and covert, indeed overt, support for the Soviet Union. It was even alluded that Wilson himself was under direct influence of the Soviets. But the bottom line was the US government did not trust Wilson or his government or the British intelligence services, and therefore did not share any intelligence regarding the Victor crash. The political embarrassment about why this took place is probably the main reason it has been covered up for 43 years. The final piece in the puzzle is at the time of the Victor crash, the USA was going through its own political crisis, with Watergate and the resignation of President Richard Nixon. In 1975, the CIA reported that an investigative journalist, Jack Anderson, had uncovered the story of the Victor crash, but fortunately it was lost in the noise of Watergate. Where it's talked about in US Navy circles, the crash is known as the 1974 Victor crash, to differentiate it between another Soviet and US submarine crash off the coast of Siberia in open waters known as the 1974 Yankee crash. With the Victor crash though, neither the Soviets, the US or the UK walk away without any culpability or political embarrassment, and this is why it took until 2017 to tell us about it. And with the Soviet K306 submarine submerging in the mouth of the Holy Loch and Loch Long, and then exfiltrating submerged at periscope depth along the length of the River Clyde estuary out to the Irish Sea, that concludes our story and our video today. To this day, the British government have never mentioned this incident, and there are still many unanswered questions about exactly what happened here in 1974. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my interpretation of the events of that day. If you did, please consider liking. And if you enjoy Cold War investigations, Cold War stories, Soviet history, please consider subscribing to my channel. There'll be another video along shortly. Thanks for staying with me. Bye now.